Welcome back to the Texas Appellate Law Podcast. I'm Todd Smith.
And I'm Jody Sanders.
Our guest today is Milo Bobbitt. Milo is a lawyer in Fort Worth with the law firm of Patel Gaines. And I'll let Milo tell us a little more about himself. Welcome to the show, Milo.
Thank you guys for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I can't tell you how much this podcast has really affected my appellate practice, especially as a young attorney. We were talking a little bit earlier, and I started my first appeal right around the time this podcast launched, and it's been an incredible time and journey. Just seeing like how, as this podcast has grown and the topics you have covered always seem relevant to what was going on in my next appeal or my next stage of practice. So I would always be like, okay, what's this episode about? And it's like, oh, hey, jury charges. Great.
Well, you're flattering us right out of the gate, Milo.
That's right.
We appreciate that. And we were talking too before we started recording that this is kind of a unique opportunity because you started practicing shortly before the podcast kicked off in 2020. I think you started in 2019 or so. But let's launch into sort of your background and what led you to become a lawyer, and here's your story.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a small town, North Idaho, called Coeur d'Alene. I always tell people it's up in the Panhandle, right south of Canada. Even though Idaho is the famous potato state, I know nothing about farming potatoes. Did not grow up on a potato farm, but very early on, my mom met my former stepdad, so we moved to his house in the middle of the woods, kind of about an hour or so outside town. And I spent most of my childhood growing up without running water or electricity.
Wow.
Which was interesting to say the least. I'm very thankful because it helped instill a great work ethic in me, but there's nothing like most kids were running around playing in the summer. I was stacking firewood. And then, so I grew up in Idaho. After I graduated high school, I took a year off to rehab an injury from football that I suffered. I always wanted to play college football, specifically because college is just expensive. And most of my life, my mom was a single mother. So it was a way for me to try and pay for my education. After taking the year off, I walked onto the University of Montana's football team. And then after walking on, sustained another injury to my knee. And I was like, man, there's got to be more to life than football, especially like walking is a big one.
Yeah.
And kind of realized that I was at a fork in the road. It's like I can continue on the path where most of my friends were going, or my dream was always to move to Texas. My dad was born in Amarillo, Texas, grew up in Texas, somehow made it up to Idaho. Not entirely sure about that story still. But he always spoke very highly of Texas. And growing up in the woods, I had a horse named Oates, and I'd always play the Lone Ranger. And I was really into cowboys. Like I was that kid who showed up in school, a cowboy tie, cowboy boots. And so when I got injured, I was at Montana. I saw an opportunity to pursue my dream. So I sold everything I owned and bought a one-way plane ticket to Texas and didn't look back. And then when I arrived in Texas, I knew that I wanted to become a lawyer. And I've always one of those rare people who knew from a very young age, like, that's what I want to do. And I think I first became interested in it because you'd always see lawyers dressed up in suits, and I heard that they got to go to court and argue. Well, when I moved to Texas, I moved to Austin, Texas, where my dad's side of the family all lives, and didn't know how to get to law school, didn't know what the LSAT really was or what lawyers actually do, except for what I had seen on television shows. And I met a family friend who is a patent attorney in Austin, and he kind of explained the whole process for me. So that was my first introduction to law and the LSAT. But growing up in North Idaho, one of the things that's kind of unique to my story is that when I was born partially deaf due to a rare birth disease. And so I had to teach myself how to read and write at a very young age. And somehow, one way or the other, I'm not complaining, but my hearing naturally progressed. So that did present some difficulties, and I was able to kind of work through that. We can get in more about that later, but ended up going to A&M to much of the chagrin of my family. My family on my dad's side's all Longhorns. So, and I'm the only Aggie. And so I went to A&M for undergrad and then found my way to law school.
And I guess that's how you wound up in Fort Worth, is to go to A&M Law School.
Yes, and I remember when I first heard that A&M had bought Texas Wesleyan's old law school, and I was like, okay, they have a law school. Why isn't it in College Station? But now I'm so happy that's in Fort Worth because of the opportunities that we have here in Fort Worth, Dallas being close by. I think it would have been really hard for A&M to have this meteoric rise that we've been seeing the past couple of years. the law school wasn't College Station.
Well, we had Dean Bobby Audier on the show, and he did a great job of being a cheerleader for the law school. And we've commented before. I mean, Jody's in Fort Worth, and I'm from Fort Worth, so we certainly respect what A&M has done,
Absolutely.
building the school there, and it's just quite an opportunity for a lot of people. But gosh, it's gotten to be a pretty competitive place to try and get into,
Yeah.
from what I understand.
Well, I am so happy that I applied and got in when I did, because nowadays I'm not so sure. Yeah, I think Dean Bobby's just been incredible for the law school, and has been like the perfect fit for the law school. And I don't know how he has so much energy constantly. I don't know what kind of, he doesn't drink coffee. I'm just like, if I could bottle that. And I remember listening to his episode on here and hearing his background, and I had known a little bit about it. And then I saw him at a conference a little while after I listened to the episode, and I was like, this whole thing about Russia, you never brought up in any of our conversations.
That's right. I'd forgotten
So,
about that.
yeah, I was like, okay, sir.
So you buy your one-way plane ticket to Texas. You come down, you find your way, much to the chagrin of your family, to Texas A&M. And so you go through A&M and take the LSAT and wind up at A&M Law School. That's quite a road that you put yourself on, considering what you described to us as your background.
Yeah, I always tell people that I got sick and tired of the winters up in Idaho. Negative 20-degree weather is just not fun. There's
Oh
no
my
way to
gosh.
escape the cold. And really was fortunate to find A&M. I was dead set on going to Texas, but then when I went to A&M for a visit just to check it out, like, it wasn't even on my radar or consideration because I was such a die-hard Longhorn at the time. And then when I visited it, I was like, wow, this campus really is something. There's something special here that I can connect with. And it was a great little college town to go to because there weren't all the big distractions they have in other cities, especially in Texas with all the musical festivals. So I could just really hunker down and focus on doing well to get to the next stage of my life, which was law school.
Sounds like you took charge of that direction. I mean, like I said, it's quite an initiative you took in getting a one-way ticket to Texas, but
No kidding.
we talk a lot about mentoring on this show, and you mentioned your family friend who was an IP lawyer.
Mhm.
I guess he provided you some guidance, kind of told you what maybe to expect, or how did you really learn what you needed to do to get from being an undergrad at A&M to being a law student?
So he helped my mentor, who's Mr. Davis. He kind of explained to me, this is what the LSAT is. And then I did a whole bunch of research. I took the prep courses, but at A&M, I also had several professors who were very influential. One of them was my moot court coach for undergrad. He was also my constitutional law professor, and he taught me or introduced me to appellate law. We were taking this constitutional rights and liberties. He's like, if anybody's interested in law school or practice, you should come try out for our moot court team. And so I was like, all right, sounds great. I'm going to do that. I didn't even know what appellate law was at the time, or that it was his own little special practice. Being able to work with him kind of gave me an understanding and preparation for law school. Like, this is what the rigor is going to be of law school. This is what appellate lawyers and lawyers in general do. And then he helped me with prepping for the LSAT and crafting the personal statements, and also helping me decide on which law school to go to. I wasn't initially set on A&M. I thought I was going to circle back to UT's law school, but I like being an Aggie so much. I was like, I'm going to continue this. And my new core coach, really convinced me on A&M. He's like, this school is going to be on the rise. And he turned out to be right. And he also kind of helped me get plugged into, this is how like writing and grammatical works for lawyers and how it's different from what I was doing in undergrad writing as a political science major.
So poli-sci, then you graduate and you head up to A&M. What you had that mentoring and that advice as you are getting ready to enter law school. What about when you got there in 1L year? Had you been prepared for that in any way?
A little bit. I understood like how to read and brief a case from mid court, but then it was just like, I don't think anything can really prepare you for law school. It's one of those things you just got to jump in and commit to. It was very intense. Also had a great group of kids that were formed study groups that were also very supportive at A&M. And then after my first semester at law school, I was back in Austin during winter break, and Justice Willett, or now Judge Willett, but at the time he was at the Texas Supreme Court still. And when I moved to Texas. I kind of did some research and I learned of his story. And I sent him a tweet or message on Twitter asking, like, hey, would you like to meet for coffee? And that experience led to an internship opportunity with Judge Willett at the Texas Supreme Court right before he got nominated and confirmed to the Fifth Circuit. And that was just an amazing experience. Also, Kristen LaFleur,
Mhm.
infamous KVT, was
Mhm.
clerking for Judge Willett at the time while I got intern too. And she was an incredible mentor during that time and helped me really work on honing my legal writing, because when Todd and I spoke, and I kind of mentioned earlier, being born partially deaf and having to teach myself how to read and write, I went into law school understanding like nouns, verbs, commas, but drafting a sentence, the grammatical rules, things that most people learn in like primary school and elementary school, I had to really hunker down on and focus on and teach myself getting ready for this internship with Judge Willett, just because having to teach myself how to read and write
Mm-hmm.
was just a lot of like picking up the patterns and seeing like, okay, this is how you craft a sentence and just understanding it that way. But then when you get to intern for a Supreme Court justice, you really want to have your writing on point. And I
Mhm.
really wanted to get the most of the opportunity that I was presented with there. So I was like, I need to really focus on improving my writing skills so that one, I don't look like a fool when I go there, but two, I'm able to gain the most out of this opportunity.
Talk about trial by fire, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Throwing yourself off the deep end. Well, that makes me want to ask you, well, a couple of follow-ups, really. First of all, what resources did you look to when you were really trying to bone up, getting ready to do that internship? There's a lot of good legal writing guides. Did you consult any of those, or any of those special to you or have a big influence on you?
Yes. So I started reading a lot of any Brian Gardner book or blog post I could find. I read that, really diagnosed that. And then also, as silly as this does kind of sound, the GRE, there's a section on there for writing, and I'm not sure what it's called, but there's a lot of practices like diagramming a sentence,
Mhm.
placing grammatical, like this is where a comma goes, this is where a semicolon goes,
Mm-hmm.
editing sentences. So doing that kind of practice. And then we had a Lawyer Writes, I believe was the book we used for my 1L writing class, and really just grabbed onto those and um, dove deep into researching those. And then also the elements of style were very helpful. And then also a lot of just Googling, trying to find practice exercises. I mean, I did spend a lot of time before my internship really doing practice exercises to try and hone my writing skills even further. So I didn't look like a fool, because that was my biggest thing, is like, I don't want to ruin this for future students from A&M's
Mm-hmm.
law school. And I also don't want to embarrass myself.
Google as a learning tool is underrated. I think a lot of attorneys get a lot of good information just starting out on Google, even if it's something like grammatically, how does this work? I do that all the time. Like if something doesn't sound right, sometimes I'll hop on Google and say, okay, is it this or that? Or which one's right? Or why is it right? And I still do that.
Yeah, and it's especially helpful for me because I don't know how to sound out words. That's one of the things
Mm,
that I have been able to overcome from being partially deaf. So if I come across a word that I don't know how to pronounce or understand, I look at the words on either side of it and kind of just through deductive reasoning come up with that. But that doesn't always work. Or if I'm preparing to give an oral argument and there's a tricky word or a tricky name,
mm.
Google's gotten really good about how to break it down a word and also how to pronounce it correctly too.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
Interesting.
little tips and tricks like that.
I've consulted the dictionary of Google many times. If a phrase flows into my head as I'm drafting, I'm not 100% sure that it means what I think it means.
Yep.
Yes.
I will check myself,
Yeah.
because there's nothing worse than using a phrase incorrectly when you think But I just have to say, I mean, that's all just fascinating to
It
me.
is.
And I just applaud you for taking the initiative all the way through. It's a really interesting story. When you talk about your early childhood and being born partially deaf, I mean, was this like undiagnosed, or what was the background, and did you were able to get any treatment for it as a youngster, or did you just have to kind of overcome it on your own?
A little bit of overcoming it on my own and a little bit of just luck of having my ears naturally improve, my hearing naturally improve as I grew older. When I was born, the doctor said like, "Hey, there's nothing we can really do. You'll be lucky if he makes it the first hour, let alone the first night." And I just kept on fighting through. Apparently, I had that fighting Texas Aggie spirit in me the whole time. Just didn't know it.
Yeah.
And my mom is also a speech pathologist, so that was
Mhm.
extremely helpful. But when I started, learning words and hearing better, I started speaking like just rapid fire, almost like an auctioneer. So my sister had to sit me down and have me read aloud and read poetry aloud to work on my cadence and my pronunciations.
Mhm.
So I'm not really talking fast like an auctioneer. And my mom would also help me with some exercises that she would bring home from work too to help me work on sounding words out. And that way, I don't speak sign language anymore as fluently as I did, but that was having to learn that early on. My mom kind of picked some of that up and then she would teach me. And it's a skill that I wish I still had.
Sure. Well, I will say just from having talked with you outside of this conversation, it's not obvious that you came up with that disability. So again, I'll just
No, not at all.
applaud you for getting to where you are. It's a very interesting story, and
It is.
good for you. All right. So now tell us about how you got to Patel Gaines. Well, actually, I want to back up from that a little bit and go through your time in law school just a little bit, because I think Dean Bobby, as you call him, I think he answers to that. I think in his conversation with us, he spoke about the sort of unity in the classes at A&M Law School and how the Aggie spirit, kind of, even though most of those folks are not Aggie undergrads, that there's, something to the Aggie spirit even at the law school, even though it's not in College Station. Was that your experience as well? Or, what do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I would say that the law school has done a great job carrying over the traditions and the Aggie spirit from main campus in College Station over to Fort Worth, and creating an atmosphere where people who don't really have any background or knowledge of A&M and M and its rich history of traditions, and having them, I don't want to say like buy into it, but welcome it or warm up to it. And I think a lot of that is just putting in the time and the effort. We have the big event that we still do, and which main campus also does. I think ours is different. But then we also have we have a bus shuttle that goes to A&M football games. So if you find time in law school to go to an A&M football game, you have the opportunity. But also bringing people from main campus to kind of come and talk about A&M and its traditions. And this is what really it means to be an Aggie. And then we also have several people who are coming from main campus. And I think that's been incredibly helpful. And then in terms of being a student there, you hear all these stories about law students. And back in the day before everything was electronic, they would like take books or whatever from the library and hide them so they could have that advantage, or not sharing outlines. It didn't matter what section you were in. We all understood like, hey, we're in this together. We all succeed if you succeed. And it was a very competitive but friendly competitive atmosphere. Like, I want to beat you, but I want to beat you at your best. And so everybody was helping. If you didn't understand something, you can go to somebody and they would help you out. We were always sharing the practice questions that they had, I think, like, from Barbary and all these other third parties. Somebody would like scan it in and then they'd just make a mass email that goes out. Here's all these practice questions. And it didn't matter if you were in the same section or small group, everybody was there to help each other, which was, I think, made a really big difference of alleviating the stress and anxiety that comes from law school, because a lot of law school comes down to your final exams. We're all getting to that point as at the end of the semester, the grind of this semester is kind of taking its toll. To have that group there of just people to be like, hey, this is law school. I always described it as a beautiful kind of pain. It's hard, but you get to pursue something that you're really passionate about. And I think having that atmosphere really makes A&M different. And I think a lot of that atmosphere ties back to the traditions and the values of in the spirit of A&M.
Right.
When you were in law school, did you have a sense of what you wanted to do when you got out? Did you know you wanted to do litigation? Did you kind of, going in not knowing as much about law, just wondered if you had a thought about where you wanted to be?
I would say going in, I was a person who it's like the typical undergrad who changed their major several times. Going in, I wanted to be a litigator or an appellate attorney. Then I took contracts and I was like, oh, transactional work sounds interesting. I tried that out for a summer, half the summer before I went intern with Willett. And during that time, I quickly discovered transactional law is not for me. it is, I just didn't enjoy it as much as litigation. So I was very open about like, hey, these are the different avenues, and I'm happy that I got to try transactional law out and figure
Mhm.
out that it wasn't for me. But going in, I definitely wanted to do appellate work after doing moot court competitions, and I just always viewed it. I'm like, this is like you are the tip of the spear as an appellate attorney, and that's nothing to against trial or litigators, but I really enjoyed the aspect of the research and the writing that went into it.
Hmm.
Appellate work. So I was like, okay, I want to at least be doing this, and then working or interning for Judge Will just fueled my passion for appellate law. So after that, I was like, okay, this is what I'm dead set on now. But I always encourage students whenever I talk to them, like, try different things out, try different areas out, figure out what you like, you don't like. I've had friends who are like, I'm going to be a transactional lawyer. They end up going to be a prosecutor or a criminal defense
Hmm.
attorney. So just be open minded. For me, it was started out with litigation and appellate work, veered off, came back to the light, ended up doing appellate work.
Come back to the light, Milo.
Yeah.
I
That's
like it.
good. I mean, I think that's not an atypical path. That part of your journey is not atypical because so many of us have in mind what we want to do going into law school and wind up doing something completely different. But no, and it's interesting that you got to try out transactional. That's something I never did. I don't feel like I missed out on not doing that, but
I think you made the right decision.
I know what you mean though about once you get that taste of whether it's through an internship or a mentoring relationship early on, once you get a taste of what appellate work is all about. I mean, you mentioned moot court too as being part of one of the things that kept you on that path. It's nice to be able to decide that this is what you want to do and be able to pursue it. So let's talk about how you got into your firm and how your career so far. I mean, you're a going on 6-year lawyer, I guess. And so you've had a chance to do some things at this point in your career. Tell us about what you do day in and day out at Patel Gaines.
So day in and day out, I would say my practice, I do about 70% appellate work, 30% trial litigation, and most of the trial litigation is dispositive motion. Recently started working on jury charges now too, which is a lost art, I feel like, because it's so hard to get to a jury trial. I feel like most cases get either settle or summary judgment or another dispositive motion. But I started here this summer as a law clerk, this summer going into my 3L year, and was very fortunate that I had an attorney who the partner that I worked for kind of saw at it very early on, like, hey, this kid has something in terms of writing and researching. So when I was a law clerk, I started working on this case that would eventually go on to be the first appellate case that I worked on. And we were working on this response to a summary judgment motion, and we were struggling with it. And one day I came in, I'm like, I figured it out. My boss looked at me, he's like, did you sleep on the ground? And I was like, yeah, but I figured out this issue. Who did I hire? This weirdo kid. But so I started out as a 3L, I guess, going into my 3L year, worked during the school year, took some time off for the bar exam, and then afterwards, was lucky enough to be hired on as an associate. Starting out, I mostly did trial work, trial litigation work. I remember I got sworn in, Judge Willett swore me in, and then after he did that, I had to drive down for a hearing and another matter, and it was like, oh, sworn in, here you go, here's your first solo hearing. So it was
Nice.
which I won. I was like starting off on the right foot, and so that was exciting. And when I got here, my boss had done some appellate work in the past, but he hasn't really wasn't really an established appellate practice here. And after the case I was working on when I first got here, it went to trial. We won at trial, and then it was up on appeal. And he was kind of like, "Here's the keys. See what you can do with this." And it was this big oil and gas contract case, and it was like the partner's big victory, a career case. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're handing a teenager the keys to a red Ferrari."
Hey, no pressure on your first case, by the way, after, trying to defend a
Yeah,
win. Yeah.
yeah, and was fortunate with that. And I remember when I started here, I was kind of hesitant about appellate work. I was like, maybe I wanted to do this, but maybe it's something that wasn't really in my wheelhouse. It kind of felt like I'm like, oh, this is for people who go on and do clerkships. And I had that opportunity with Judge Willett. And so he was really, I'm very fortunate in having somebody who saw the potential in me and pushed me in that right direction, and then also gave me the support that I needed. And for the other partners, so my firm has offices in San Antonio and Houston, and the two Patel and Gaines both worked out of San Antonio. And they've also been great about giving me opportunities to work on appeals and appellate cases to pursue this new practice area that hadn't been set up at the firm. They normally would go out and like refer their appeals to appellate attorneys in the San Antonio area. So when they saw me, they was like, "Hey, this guy wants to do it, and he, was willing to put the time and energy and effort into it. We'll give him opportunities and see where it goes." And I'm very, very thankful for that. And I remember this was speaking going back to the appeal in this podcast. Right as I was handling those appeals, when this podcast came out, and as somebody who had very limited experience and about drafting actual appellate documents, and like appellate motions and the appellate procedure, I was like, okay, there's a lot of resources out there. It's almost overwhelming. But finding this podcast on appellate Twitter was very pivotal to me to becoming where I am now, I feel like. And I don't mean to say, I don't just say that to flatter you. I'm being 100% honest
But
because,
we appreciate it even if you
yeah,
do.
No, please
yeah,
continue.
yeah. And I remember the first episode I listened to was with Justice Boyd. And I was like, okay, here we go. Let's get some deep insights here. And
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, because we talk a lot, and even recently we've mentioned that sometimes it's hard to know who listens.
yeah,
We hear, both of us will be approached by folks who do listen and will comment on the podcast and tell us that they enjoy it. But I will say that I don't think that I've ever had someone in your position who was basically with us from the beginning
Mm-hmm.
ever come up to me and say the things that you have said, and both in private and just now. And it does make us feel good to be able to help a law student or young lawyer along in their career. I think that's something that we didn't specifically set out to do that, but that completely fits with what we were trying to do from the start. So thanks for saying that, Milo. We appreciate it.
yeah. And then another thing I really appreciate about this podcast too is that you guys, when the introduction, like pull back the curtains on the appellate process, you guys really do that and do a great job of having that, but also humanizing judges and justices. I have had conversations with Justice Busby, Justice Young, Justice Blacklock, Justice Bland, almost everybody in the Texas Supreme Court. And for the longest time, I was always very hesitant about approaching them and just asking them questions, not like specific case questions, but just general advice, because these are these figures that you look up to, and we tend to put judges on this pedestal and forget like, hey, they're humans too. And having the episodes, really seeing that side of them has helped give me the confidence to approach and be like, hey, you said this, Justice Bubsy, and this, and I actually use this. And the conversation just started going from there. And you can always pick up little tips and tricks from that way too. And it's been incredible.
Well,
Glad to
thanks
hear
for
that.
publicizing us.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, it means a lot to us to be able to have the justices, whether from the Supreme Court or the other courts, and trial judges too, be so willing to share their knowledge and wisdom and tips. I think it's kind of like you have a front row seat. Someone in your position, gets the opportunity to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, and it's not
Yes.
sitting in a hotel, conference space and at a CLE or something. It's listening, driving down the road in your car or out for a run or something like that. So, yeah, it's. I mean, everybody knows how I feel about and how Jody feels about doing the show, but just being able to hear somebody with your perspective comment on how it's been valuable to you means a lot. All right, so you had that first case, and yeah, no pressure. You don't want to lose the big win
Oh my
from
goodness.
from the firm. I'll just ask you, did you win on
Yes,
appeal?
we went on appeal, and there's been a couple past episodes where we talked about judicial opinions having quote unquote cute language. Well, I'm fairly proud of the fact that in the opinion, they quoted the Armageddon movie when Billy Bob Thornton is describing this, and I was like, I have an opinion where this is like, there's this movie quote in there, and I was like, it fit perfectly because of it was describing this oil and gas field in Pennsylvania. and the description kind of lined up with the description of an asteroid in Armageddon. And so that was incredible. And I remember when we won, and then so they petitioned to the Texas Supreme Court, and I went straight back to that episode with Justice Boyd, and I was like, all right, so here's what he's looking for in a petition for review. How do I undermine and downplay the significance of this case so that this petition for review doesn't, get granted and I can preserve this win? And we were able to successfully defend it from there. And then shortly afterwards, the next appeal came, and then the next appeal came. And I would say for a good while, I think I was working on a month, like each month, just writing a new one, moving from there. And it started off with that case, and I was so thankful that we won. Having to go back to the partner and be like, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I crashed a red Ferrari. That was me.
Is that a Ferris Bueller reference? I don't know.
I don't know where I got that from, honestly. I was thinking, like, why did I come up with this red Ferrari reference?
That's good.
Not a bad
I like
analogy,
it.
though.
No.
Yeah.
Honestly, it kind of fits.
No, that's awesome.
So I guess what advice would you have for people who are either in law school starting out or maybe even a few years into their career that might want to do appeals? Like, you didn't do a clerkship. You're kind of like me. You didn't do the traditional path. So what are some of your tips for people that want to do it? How do you find those opportunities?
I think, and it's been said on this episode or this podcast before, but I think kind of making it vocal or known that you want to pursue these opportunities. And then also in terms of finding them, if it's not something that your firm does, or if, the firm doesn't handle appellate cases, you guys have discussed this on the show, which I didn't know about, but you can sign up for a pro bono wheel with the appellate courts. And so I always tell young students who I get asked that question a lot, well, if I'm interested in doing this, how do I do this? I'm like, make it known to the partners who want to pursue that you want to do appellate work or working on the appellate case. And if you need to find the appellate case, sign up for a pro bono case with the Court of Appeals. And what's great about that, and I've talked to several justices, and I didn't know this until I actually listened to a podcast, one of the episodes on this podcast. But if you take a pro bono case and you request oral argument for it, most of the justices will give you the opportunity to present oral argument on those pro bono cases. But I just say, be careful what you wish for, because if they grant it, you be ready to go.
That's exactly right.
As somebody who had their first oral argument, I mean, that was an incredible experience. And I always tell them, like, just if you get the opportunity, like, be prepared. Also, if you need resources, for a while, I think Appellate Twitter was just a great free resource. I put it up there,
No
right up there
question.
with Google. I'm not as active on Twitter as it is anymore. Do that. And then also, don't be afraid to reach out to appellate attorneys. You both have been very friendly and welcoming when I've come up and talked to you. I've seen Jody a couple times, events. But every time I've needed advice from an appellate attorney and just shoot them a quick email, our appellate bar here in Texas is so friendly, so welcoming, and so helpful and willing to help younger attorneys or somebody who is inexperienced and hasn't handled an appeal, willing to help them with this whole process. And that's just something I think is rare, and always encourage people to reach out.
Yep. I agree with all of those things. I think that's exactly right. We do have a very welcoming, friendly appellate bar, and people are always willing to talk. Even now, I still call people up and ask questions about things, and they're always willing to take 10 minutes or 15 minutes and, toss something around.
Yeah, I remember one time Jody actually reached out to you, and I was like, hey, my boss counsel wants to oppose an extension. I was like, listen to this episode with Blake Hawthorne. He's like, you can do it, but it's, And so I reached out, and another person who I reached out before was Rafi Melkonian. One of the Fifth Circuit cases I had, we were looking at filing. We were considering whether or not to file a motion for rehearing. And if you do in the Fifth Circuit, the rules require you to have a panel rehearing and the motion for rehearing en banc. You have to file the two at the same time.
Yeah.
So I emailed Rafi, and he was very willing to take some time to speak with me and just help me gauge and like, okay, how do I need to structure this differently from a brief that I presented? And then also pros and cons of doing this. Is it going to be worth it to the client? A lot of the advice I received, you don't pick up from an online resource or a treatise or another secondary source. So it's very great to have that valuable advice still available to you.
Very much.
Well, yeah, I'm totally, totally going to echo those comments. You can't, even if you've been doing this a long time, you can't know everything. And there's good resources out there to look things up. But, if you know somebody that does maybe a little different shade of appellate practice than you do, and it's within their wheelhouse, y'all are right. I mean, it's pretty easy to call up. If I had a question about insurance law, I know 3 or 4 insurance related appellate lawyers that I could call up and they would know the answer to whatever my question was right away. Being careful, of course, to not put anybody in a conflict situation, but
Yes.
it is so nice. And I'm glad to hear you mention Rafi and the old days of appellate Twitter. Those were kind of the good old days in some ways.
Yeah, I came into the practice a lot at the right time, I feel like, because that was really the heyday of appellate Twitter. And I picked up a lot of helpful tips in preparing for my first oral argument for that, because it's one thing to do for a moot court competition. The only thing that's on the line there is how are you going to place it. But then when you do it in real life and in practice when you're representing the client, you feel like this new added level of pressure. And that can be a good thing too, because it's going to fuel the preparation that you do. But also the argument is just going to be different from what you do in a moot court. So how to prepare for that and get ready and then present the oral argument. Twitter, reaching out to appellate attorneys. How did you prepare? How do you think of questions, to write on note cards? I think Rappy talked about that in his episode, which I totally borrowed. I had the note cards, read everything out, and I would throw them up in the air because I'm horrible at shuffling note cards and they're really big. And so we'll flip them up in the air, have them go over the floor, pick them up in random order. And the one thing I would say is if you do that and you are preparing for an oral argument, it's better to actually recite or say your response to the question on the note card out loud instead of just answering it in your head, because that way you can work on your pace and make sure you're not going so fast when you answer a question. And it's very different when you are speaking it out loud too, because you also have to control your breath. And so just blurting something out really quickly, which is what I wanted to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Great advice. Well, you're obviously carved out your niche in the firm, and I think it's great that you've done what you set out to do, which is to become sort of the in-house appellate lawyer there at your firm. That's exactly what you said is exactly what I tell people all the time, is just make it known what it is you want to do. And I even will go so far as to say volunteer to do the things that nobody else wants to do.
Yeah, that's what kind of got me started.
Some trial lawyers hate jury charges.
Absolutely.
Or they hate dispositive motions, or at least having to respond to them. Filing them can be kind of fun, but the responses, it's like, ooh, who can I pawn this off on?
Yeah.
But those are two of the best avenues I can think of to getting into the meat and potatoes of appellate work. And if you can establish yourself as kind of the go-to law-related motions person, and being within a firm that before didn't have somebody internally to bring in on these kinds of matters, I mean, that makes you very valuable to your firm.
It does.
So I applaud you for that as well, because you've done kind of what I preach to people is one great approach to becoming an appellate lawyer. And so I'm happy to see that what I tell people is correct.
Yeah.
It's been a long time for me.
Yeah, most definitely. And it can be a little daunting at first, especially if you volunteer for something and you're not entirely sure. I'm like, okay, what do I need to do? I just volunteered for this and I have no idea what, the first step is in this process. And just take that with faith. If it's something you're really interested in doing, try it out. I always encourage people to do that. No matter what practice or time in your career you are, just be willing to try something new is a big thing that I think overcoming that, hesitancy is a big thing to overcome. But when you do, it's very rewarding, I always feel like.
Absolutely. And by the way, I think at this point, when you talk about the good old days of something, you're now like a seasoned lawyer by timing.
Yeah, I was having that conversation and somebody with the law student, and they're just like, so talking to me, I'm like, oh man, I feel like a seasoned lawyer now. I guess I'm not the newest shows yet, not the young attorney that I am anymore. Or recently, been very fortunate to do some CLE presentations on appellate law too. And I'm like, I remember being in the audience being like, oh man, those guys really know what they're doing. And now I'm just like, I kind of wing it sometimes.
Yep. You've discovered the secret of giving a CLE presentation right there.
That's right.
Yes. Yes.
The old adage, fake it till you make it, still
Mhm.
applies. Even
And I
at
think there's so
your
much truth to
phase.
that too. If I could just speak on that really quickly, is like you speak of like this. A lot of attorneys I speak to, or new attorneys or like law students, they have like this imposter syndrome, and I always tell them the best way to overcome that. I feel through my experience has been you till you make it. You know, like if you don't belong here, find a way to convince yourself in your head that, you do belong here. And kids, you do. There's a reason why you're here in this point. And if you take it with that approach, I feel like you will find the correct path to go down. You'll find the answer, the first step, which will lead to the next step, which will lead to the next step. And that is going to, you'll feel a, you'll feel a sense of accomplishment and that you'll be happy that you did. You just got to get over that little like anxiety moment.
Yeah. Great advice.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, now that you've gotten to this point in your career, what do you see? How do you see yourself approaching your practice over, say, the next 5-year period? What do you want to do with your career?
I mean, as every appellate attorney, I think it'd be great to have a Supreme Court case, whether that be the U.S. Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court. But over the next 5 years, I would really want to focus on improving my skills. I know that sounds cliche, but like I really want to hone my legal research and writing, and then also find new creative opportunities to help law students give back to those because I'm here because of so many incredible mentors that I've had. And I had another mentor in Austin, and he's like, those who have accomplished so many things in life have the privilege, but also the responsibility to help others do the same. So I want to be active in the law school, but also getting to that point in my career too, where it is, hey, I need to go out and get my own clients. So how do you go about doing that? Especially as an appellate attorney, your clients are mostly going to be trial lawyers because it's
Mhm.
very rare you're going to find a business that needs like, I have an appellate case and I need an appellate attorney. So stepping out of my comfort zone, I tend to be more of an introverted person, being more extroverted to connect and meet new trial lawyers and hopefully grow this appellate practice even more here. My create new opportunities for me in the firm would be great. And also, yeah, just get to the Texas Supreme Court. I'm hoping that they revise the petition for you so we know whether
Yeah.
or not, like, if you write a brief and then if you get to the briefing stage, the petition's granted because it's always awkward going back to the client and being like, we did all this briefing, but they came back this way. And I understand that's still under review. And so that's where I like to see it. I also just do another oral argument. When you have your first oral argument, you kind of get the bug. And I remember my first oral argument was in New Orleans, and that was just such an incredible courthouse to go visit, but also just the adrenaline rush I felt when I was up there too. It was incredible. And I remember when we were the first oral argument of the day. When I was there, Rafi actually walked through the door, and it was incredible to meet him and kind of speak with him. And he was giving me some tips. And he's like, I remember my first case. It was about a lifeguard. And I was like, he's like, what's your case about? I'm like, federal takings claims post Nick and recent changes to Texas preclusion law. And he was like, yep. He's like,
Hey,
you're going to do great. And I was like, I hope so. And
for you,
afterwards, he was very kind, and he came up to me and he's like, you did great. And I was like, really? Because I felt like I could have done so much better. And I think, I'm always like my worst critic. Last night, I actually ran into Judge Corey Wilson, who was on the panel for the oral argument that I gave, and he actually remembered the argument. I was like, for better or for worse. We didn't win, unfortunately, but it was great to kind of just talk about him. And he was like, that was a really tough issue. That was your first oral argument? I was like, yep.
so we don't have a mailbag segment today, but one thing I did want to give as a general PSA is those of us who are still on Twitter, there's been some discussion over the last 6 months or so about some issues with how to cite Court of Appeals opinions now that we've got 15 and not 14 courts of appeals and so forth. And I might have been guilty of doing a little general grousing about that. But now we've heard from the Texas Law Review editorial board, and they approached us and invited our listeners specifically to give feedback because the TLR editorial board and their Green Book committee have opened up for public comment the opportunity to make some speakers to give some feedback rather on any changes that need to be made. And so now is the time for those of us that have been discussing potential changes that need to be made to give input on that. There's a submission form that's open and available to be filled out. We'll drop a link to the submission form in our show notes for this show. It's real important if you hear this episode before April the 9th of 2025, you act on that quickly, because that is when we're told that the comment period will close. And so please give the editors of the Texas Law Review your feedback. They only do revisions periodically. I think the current issue or edition of the Blue Book is the 15th edition. And so that tells you how rarely this opportunity comes around to suggest these kinds of changes. So check out the link and give your feedback so that they can take all this into consideration, everybody's opinions about what needs to change, and get us uniform in the way that we cite certain things, particularly the 15th Court of Appeals. And when we can all have the benefit of everyone's feedback and comments in the next edition.
Milo, we really appreciate you coming and talking with us today. This is great. As we kind of get to the end of our time, it's always our tradition, as you know, to wrap up with a tip or war story. So I'll let you pick which one and send us out here.
Oh, so I've been thinking about this, and it's been hard. I feel like I'm fairly new in my career. We've covered a lot, but a war story I had was I was in this case. My boss was presenting an oral argument, and we were the appellant, and so we gave our case. And then at the end of I don't know if this has happened to anybody, but at the end, the appellee, we had done rebuttal, and the appellee gets up and he's like, "Can I just have like 5 quick minutes to address something really quickly?" And I just shut around, and I was like, "Absolutely not. That's not how this procedure works. You have to go through all these things." And was going back and forth with this attorney, and the judges were just kind of like, "You can file a post-submission brief if you would like to address this point." It was kind of just, I feel like that was a unique situation. I was like, I did not see that coming.
Yeah, that's a new one.
I've
But
never seen that either.
in terms of tips, I would just encourage people, especially the young lawyers, reach out. If you want to try something new, don't be afraid to try something new. Don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone, but also just reach out. If you need help with something, we're all here to help. And I feel like we tend to be, oh, I'd want to do that, but like, I don't think I can because I lack this. Well, you can always figure out what you need to do. So don't hesitate to reach out. It's never too late to make a change or make a pivot if you want to do something. And then also just the words of advice from my mom: be good, do good, and see good. Be a good person, be good to people, and the world may be a better place because of it.
Wow. That's great advice, of course. Well, thank you, Milo, for being with us. We're super happy to get the chance to visit with you and appreciate all your support of the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you guys, not only just for the podcast, but for this opportunity. It has been an incredible journey to see how this podcast has grown over the past 5 years. And I can't thank you guys enough for all the help you didn't know yet you were giving me.
That means a lot. Thanks again.